Hey folks, I'm brownbear. Today I'll be doing a critique of Yooka-Laylee. Yooka-Laylee was one of my most anticipated games of 2017. I'm a huge fan of the banjo games going back all the way to the original Nintendo 64. When I heard that some of the original developers at Rare had started work on a spiritual successor, I could barely contain my excitement. Unfortunately, my time with Yooka-Laylee was very disappointing, to the point that I mostly skipped the last level. Over the next 6 months I would periodically return and see if the game would finally stick. Each time I walked away with the same feeling of disappointment. Eventually I decided to make this video, and offer my perspective as to where Yooka-Laylee went wrong. This video is organized into 5 different sections. I recommend you watch them front to back, but there are timestamps in the description if you'd prefer to skip around. Number 1. Incoherent level design. Yooka-Laylee's fundamental problem is that it's boring and uninspired, a theme that we'll revisit throughout this video. Its level design is arguably its biggest problem. In banjo-kazooie, the level design flowed outward. That means levels were only as large as the sum total of interesting sections a level designer could put in them. Many players aren't aware that banjo-kazooie was originally envisioned as a 2.5-dimensional platformer. This means its worlds would be rendered in 3 dimensions, but its camera would be completely fixed. While Banjo eventually transitioned into full-blown 3D, its heavy-handed camera retained much of the original vision. You can see examples of this throughout the entire game. This section leading up to the Gobi's Valley painting, this section around Click Clock Wood, and this section in Clanker's Cavern all feature an essentially fixed camera. The advantage of this approach is that levels must flow in a logical way, since a player's direction is effectively designated by the designer. This means worlds are built first and foremost from the perspective of how players traverse them, a critical feature in a game centered on exploration and adventure. You can look at some of Banjo's earlier sketches to see how meticulous the designers were in crafting individual levels. This process is naturally resistant to filler content, because every inclusion requires explicit justification. Super Mario 64 is a great comparison. As a pure platformer, it wanted to create lots of space for players to mess around, and its use of a single collectible per world meant that players would never lose sight of their objective. Back when I was a kid, I would often load up Mario 64 and just run around the first level, taking advantage of the unused space to experiment and discover secrets. I'd never do something like that in Banjo because there simply wasn't an opportunity. The emphasis on puzzle solving and adventure meant that worlds were meant to be explored and cleared. There was no wasted space. Yooka-Laylee is much less meticulous in the way it constructs its levels. With the exception of Moody Maze Marsh, each world is a wide open area dotted with various challenges. Because there's no implied flow, players easily get lost and end up retracing their steps. In a pure platformer like Mario 64, this would have been fine. Each world instance would only contain a single objective, and the rest would be a playground for players to experiment and mess around. But because Yooka-Laylee borrows its collectible and instancing design from Banjo, it forces its players to navigate anything and everything, even if those things have no reason to exist. Compare the out-of-order slot machines pagey with the Crocodile's Jiggy from Bubble Gloop Swamp. The latter is intentionally arranged such that players will organically discover the next crocodile in the natural course of navigating the level. There's no need to intentionally hunt them down. By contrast, the out-of-order slot machines force the player to traverse the entire world again, regardless of how much or how little of it they've explored. This pagey doesn't connect with the rest of the player's journey in a coherent way. Yooka and Laylee were designed to be mechanically faster and stronger than Banjo-Kazooie, and they can chain moves together like Super Mario. This forces out the space needed for any individual challenge, but it doesn't explain how to connect those challenges together. When that's not an issue, like with the isometric palace, Yooka-Laylee really shines. But such situations are an exception to the general rule. A good example of this is the logical inconsistencies. Consider the ice cave near the start of World 2. If you enter the nearby door, you're teleported to the complete opposite side of the map. This doesn't make any sense, and if you jump off the cliff you can confirm this for yourself. The 2 doors are nowhere near one another. It feels like the designers built these 2 sections separately and then realized that they needed to connect them somehow, so they just added a random door. You see a similarly confusing issue in the hub world, where the top of Capital B's tower somehow connects to its bottom, near the book leading into World 2. These attempts at connecting the world together are frequently punctuated with complete dead ends. Consider the boss fight in World 1. It's a giant ramp extending into nothing. The transformation segment in Moody Maze Marsh and the giant slides in Capital Casino are also good examples of a dead end getting glued onto a world instead of connecting with it in a coherent or reasonable way. Banjo-Kazooie featured dead ends as well, but it made sure that they made sense in the context of the world. The termite tower blends in with the backing aesthetic, while the backtracking in the engine room is worked into a pretty interesting jiggy. All of these quality issues take place on the backdrop of worlds that are simply too large. In Banjo-Kazooie, Rare faced severe hardware limitations in what they could include in the game. The original Nintendo 64 only contained about 4 megabytes of memory. During my in-depth commentary series, I not only emphasized the advantages of this constraint, I also pointed out the trap that modern hardware creates for modern games. Modern developers have the luxury of building extremely large worlds at little to no cost. Back in the 90s, this wasn't the case. If Rare wanted to include something in Banjo-Kazooie, they really needed to think it through. The result is that a limitation, the inability to create infinitely large worlds, ends up acting as an asset, because it forced the developers to make good decisions about what they included in their game. Most of Yooka-Laylee's worlds are neither aesthetically interesting nor necessary from a gameplay perspective. They exist solely to connect together the actual content. This is usually done through massive expanses of useless and empty space. Galleon Galaxy is the epitome of this design philosophy, featuring little more than a series of islands connected by nothing. It's amazing to me that a game intended to revive the 3D platforming genre constructed an entire level that largely abandons the concept, and instead encourages the player to fly from area to area. I can't emphasize enough the importance of flow in the level design of a 3D platformer. Anyone can open up the Unity engine and make a character jump up and down in a 3D environment. What makes it a game is the design, the care and thoughtfulness put into how levels flow. Compelling level design is the result of intentional work. It's not something that merely emerges by taking different challenges and gluing them together. Number 2. Boring level design. Yooka-Laylee's levels are just not that interesting, and this is a separate issue from whether or not they flow in a logical way. The first problem is a choice to remove secondary collectibles. In Banjo-Kazooie, eggs, feathers, and mumbo tokens filled out areas of the game that would have otherwise felt empty. This resolved the design conflict between density and exploration. The former constrains world size, whereas the latter pushes it outward. Secondary collectibles fill in the gap by allowing the level designers to create empty space, and smooth out the flow from section to section. This bridge near the beginning of Bubble Gloop Swamp, and these trees in Gobi's Valley are both good examples. The point is not to collect these items, but merely to keep the player immersed and prevent them from feeling isolated. Yooka-Laylee streamlined several of these systems, removing eggs and feathers in favor of an energy bar and paring down mumbo tokens to just 1 per level. In combination with the wider field of view, zoomed out camera, and infinite draw distance, Yooka-Laylee's landscapes often come across like a barren wasteland. Many times during my first playthrough I would try and look down from high places in order to appreciate the view, only to have my immersion broken by the sheer emptiness of the game's levels. Here's a good example. Here's another. And here's another. The aesthetic design is similarly uninteresting. Banjo-Kazooie was brilliant in part because of its sheer creativity. Very little was reused from level to level, and individual segments felt handcrafted and bespoke. Consider Rusty Bucket Bay. Everything from the toxic goo, the hot stoves in the kitchen, and the master bedroom are aesthetically unique. They were designed explicitly for this level, and they only get used in a single area. Part of the reason Banjo was so compelling to explore was that you knew for a fact you were going to experience something new, something novel. Discovery was a first-class design feature, not merely a side effect of theming different worlds. Yooka-Laylee stumbles in this respect by copy-pasting art assets from section to section. Capital Casino is by far the worst offender here thanks to its utterly bland art design. Every section feels like it blends together. Other levels suffer from the choice to use world expansion to make 5 large worlds instead of 10 medium-sized ones. This was probably done to save money and time, but it exacerbates the already major problem of homogeneity in design. Virtually every aspect of the game suffers from this problem. Yooka-Laylee reuses the corplet and the googly eyes in almost every combat situation. Wooden platforms show up everywhere. Ring-based challenges are probably the laziest way possible to construct a platforming segment, and they too show up everywhere. In Click Clock Wood, there's a self-deprecating joke about Gobi heading to the lava world, mocking the notion that the only difference between levels was a surface-level asset flip. Sadly, that seems to be precisely the philosophy that guided the development of Yooka-Laylee. Number 3. Collectible Design. Yooka-Laylee's collectible design is repetitive and uninspired. Like the aesthetic design, it lacks the fundamental creativity of Banjo-Kazooie. To illustrate, consider the different jiggies in Mad Monster Mansion. Sneak behind a sleeping ghost by entering through the mansion's chimney. Fill flower pots with eggs. Complete the ice skating game while being chased by a ghost. Transform into a pumpkin and go inside Lago. Transform into a pumpkin and go inside the gutter. Dive into a well. Climb the tower. Play the organ. Explore the cellar. And collect all 5 Jinjos. Aside from number 7, which is reminiscent of Treasure Trove Cove, and the Jinjo's quest, which is reused in all 9 levels, every jiggy in the mansion is tailor-made for the level. Many of them feature art and design assets that are completely unique, like Lago or the Sleeping Ghost. The weakest Jiggy is arguably the tower climb given its resemblance to World 2, but I don't think it's unreasonable for a platformer to contain at least one platforming Jiggy per world. Contrast that with Tribal Shack Tropics. Yooka-Laylee's first world does contain several gems, including the glowing pages in the center of the map, the puzzle involving Mr. Bloat, and Blastooie at the very top. Unfortunately, these are drowned out by the number of repetitive or uninteresting challenges. There's a racing pagey, which could have been interesting had it made use of the environment proper, but instead wastes the opportunity on a circular track. This pagey also gets repeated for no apparent reason. The invisible platforms pagey is an interesting use of the sonar ability, but it too gets needlessly recycled. Saving Clara is a classic example of an early game pagey designed to teach the combat system, but it too is gratuitously reused in the next level. The platforming pagey at the top of the level, the platforming pagey near the middle, and the Shovel Knight pagey near the entrance all express the same basic concept, and they all should have been combined into a single segment. The shooting range and the boss fight are both unique encounters, but they're both implemented in the most boring way possible. Furthermore, they're both shoehorned into areas dedicated to their respective pagey instead of blended into the world proper. Rextro needs to be played twice, as is the case in every level. It seems to me like the developers were trying to hit a target number of pages instead of simply building their levels around interesting challenges. It doesn't help that many of these pages have nothing to do with the backing aesthetic, which both hurts player immersion and ignores the crucial benefit of theming different levels. Part of the problem here is the difference in collectible design from previous games. Part of Banjo-Kazooie's brilliance was the notion that collecting items was mostly a side effect of exploration. The developers designed levels to be inherently interesting and compelling to explore. As long as players traverse them in their entirety, they would by default collect every single item. One of the ways Banjo accomplished this was its use of Mumbo tokens. Many players might not realize that Banjo-Kazooie contains dozens of extra Mumbo tokens. Here's a good example of a hidden one above the entrance to Clanker's Cavern. The developers used these to incentivize exploration in various nooks and crannies, but they made them optional to avoid making item collection tedious. Banjo was primarily an exploration adventure, collecting items was just the reward loop sitting underneath it. Yooka-Laylee's removal of secondary collectibles means that world density is often achieved through quills, all of which need to be collected in order to earn a pagey. This means players will find themselves equipping the Hunter Tonic and carefully traversing levels in their entirety looking for the last remaining items. This is the opposite of Banjo's design philosophy, subordinating immersion to the task of collecting items. In combination with Yooka-Laylee's large world sizes and frequent use of wasted space, this process ends up feeling far more tedious than it does rewarding. Number 4. Bloat. Yooka-Laylee simply contains too much content. It trades a handful of high-quality features for a large number of mediocre ones. This applies to the entire experience, but it's especially true for the bonus rewards listed on Kickstarter. Let's start with Cardos. The control scheme is janky and unreliable. This is most noticeable in Capital Casino because that level's boss fight happens on a track. Spend any amount of time doing the minecart segments in Donkey Kong Country, even the original Super Nintendo iterations, and the difference in quality is night and day. Meanwhile, the Rextros minigames usually control okay, but they're just not very fun. The kart racing is padded out in length and features no other racers, while the hopping and jumping games are trivially easy. The only game I genuinely enjoyed was the one in Capital Casino. The poster child of Bloat is undoubtedly the quiz games. In Banjo-Kazooie, the Fiery Furnace quiz worked on multiple levels. It reminded players of all the cool stuff they'd seen on their adventure, it humanized Grunty, and it provided a Banjo-esque way of completing the game. Personally, I'm of the opinion that this was Banjo's true ending, and the last boss fight was only included for the most hardcore fans. Now contrast that with the Quackfire quiz. The first thing you notice is the sheer lack of creativity. Instead of an interesting board, it's just a straight line. Many of the questions are similarly uninspired, asking about trivialities like how many items you've collected, or the function of basic game mechanics. The writing is awkward and poorly done, especially when you compare it with Grunty's monologue, the longest and most interesting piece of dialogue in all of Banjo-Kazooie. Honestly, I think even the developers recognized how bad this was by allowing players to move 2 spaces for quick responses. Yooka-Laylee is a good example of how more features doesn't necessarily mean a better game. Games development is expensive and hard, and it's often better to focus your attention instead of spreading yourself too thin. Number 5. Lack of creativity. Many times in this video I've referenced Banjo-Kazooie, and I found that people sometimes interpret this as nothing more than nostalgia. For starters, I hope I've gone beyond simply referencing Banjo, and have actually explained why that game was well designed, and why Yooka-Laylee's differences detract from the experience. I don't want anyone to accept the argument that Banjo was a better designed product without clearly understanding why, and being able to point to specific instances demonstrating it. But there is truth to the idea that no game will ever truly replicate Banjo. And that's okay, I don't think anyone was looking for that. Sometimes I think people get caught up on a false dichotomy in which new games are either recycled versions of their predecessors or completely brand new things. Some games can sit on either of those two poles, but generally speaking the creative process doesn't work that way. Most creative works take a structure that makes sense, like themed worlds to convey a feeling of discovery, collecting items as a side effect reward loop, secondary collectibles to reinforce immersion, and add on the artist's vision to create something unique. In other words, you don't need to be a creative savant to build a good game. You just need to take a well-worn structure and apply your own unique talent to it. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that what I was looking for in Yooka-Laylee was the core structure of a 3D platformer, plus whatever spin Playtonic decided to add to it. So far this video has been dedicated to showing how it failed to do the former. I'd also like to point out that it failed to do the latter. There's nothing truly compelling about Yooka-Laylee, it fundamentally lacks creativity. The various Mumbo transformations are the most obvious example. 3 of them are vehicles, 1 is a school of fish, and 1 is just a plant that hops around. Where's the pumpkin that climbs down a rain gutter, or the walrus that befriends another walrus? Yooka-Laylee feels to me like the output of a word cloud of what a 3D platformer is supposed to be, instead of a creative person's vision of what they wanted it to be. Ultimately, that was what disappointed me the most. Yooka-Laylee was supposed to be an opportunity for creative people to escape the clutches of their corporate masters and produce something they were genuinely proud of, something that came from a genuine creative spark. Instead, it turned out to be just another generic 3D platformer, and not even a very good one at that. Alrighty, that's everything I had for today. Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you followed me here and on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.